From the outside, the house looked ordinary, a narrow, terraced property on a quiet residential street. Children's voices, doors opening and closing, neighbors coming and going. Nothing about it suggested that it would later become one of Britain's most studied criminal addresses. That house stood at 25 Cromwell Street, and for years it blended seamlessly into the background of everyday life. This case would later teach investigators a difficult lesson. The most dangerous environments are not always the most visible ones. Sometimes they look exactly like everyone else's home. Gloucester in the 1970s and early 80s was a working city, industrial, close-knit, and deeply routine. People knew their neighbors by sight, if not by name. Suspicion was rare. Privacy was respected. In communities like this, families were assumed to be safe by default. Domestic life stayed behind closed doors. Interference was considered rude, even improper. From a psychological perspective, this cultural norm matters. Abuse thrives where silence is mistaken for respect. Fred West was a builder by trade. He worked with concrete, foundations, and renovations. To neighbors, he was rough but familiar. A man who always seemed busy, always working on the house. He spoke plainly. He drank heavily. He did not stand out. Experts would later note something important. People who commit long-term abuse often avoid attention, not seek it. They appear predictable, unremarkable, safe. Fred fit that profile. Rose West appeared more volatile. She was loud at times, confrontational at others. But she was also seen managing a household full of children. In many communities, a woman surrounded by children signals normalcy. Busy, stressed, overwhelmed perhaps, but not dangerous. That assumption would prove catastrophic. From a psychological standpoint, this case illustrates shared offending. When two people reinforce each other's behavior, boundaries dissolve. Responsibility becomes blurred. Cruelty becomes routine. The West household was crowded. Children from different relationships, babies arriving frequently, teenagers coming and going. To the outside world, it looked chaotic but functional. Noisy homes rarely invite close inspection. Noise is mistaken for life. But specialists in family abuse recognize a warning sign here. High-control environments often disguise themselves as disorder. Confusion keeps victims disoriented. Fear keeps them silent. There were no visible chains, no barred windows, no obvious signs of captivity. Instead, control came through language, through threats, through repetition. Children were told what would happen if they spoke, not shouted, not dramatized, just stated calmly as fact. Psychologists call this fear conditioning. When consequences are repeated often enough, compliance becomes automatic. Silence feels safer than escape. Neighbors later recalled arguments, raised voices, occasional disturbances. But arguments happen everywhere. They do not trigger alarm on their own. This is one of the most important lessons of the case. Abuse rarely announces itself clearly. It hides behind behaviors that seem explainable. From an educational perspective, this case helps us understand normalization. When harm happens frequently, it stops feeling unusual to those inside it, especially to children. Looking back, investigators would identify moments that mattered. Young women entering the home, then disappearing from social circles. Children who seemed withdrawn. An atmosphere of fear that outsiders could sense, but not define. At the time, these details existed in isolation. No single moment demanded action. This fragmentation is critical. Institutions often fail not because they ignore danger, but because danger arrives in pieces. Grooming is often misunderstood as an individual act. In this case, it functioned as a family system. Authority was absolute. Rules were enforced unpredictably. Affection and punishment were interchangeable. Experts explain that this creates dependency. Victims stop evaluating right and wrong. They evaluate safety instead. And safety meant obedience. A common question emerges early in this story. Why didn't anyone say something sooner? The answer is uncomfortable. Fear works, especially when it begins young. Children raised in controlled environments do not see themselves as witnesses. They see themselves as responsible for maintaining stability. Speaking feels like betrayal. This case would later reshape how British authorities understood intra-family abuse. Silence is not consent, it is survival. To the outside world, days passed uneventfully. School runs, errands, work. Life continued at a steady pace, but inside the house, time moved differently. Rules changed without warning. Punishment was arbitrary. Psychologically, unpredictability is one of the strongest tools of control. When outcomes are random, resistance disappears. There is a small detail investigators would revisit years afterward. Fred was always renovating, digging, pouring concrete, altering the structure of the home. At the time, this meant nothing. He was a builder, that was his job. But in complex investigations, mundane details often carry the truth. What seems ordinary at first can later reframe everything. By the early 1990s, the West household had existed for decades. Children had grown, some had left, others remained. To neighbors, the family was strange but familiar. To authorities, they were invisible. And that invisibility was the final ingredient, because when harm hides behind normal life, when fear replaces trust, and when silence becomes routine, the truth does not arrive loudly. It waits. And in this case, it waited until someone inside the house finally spoke. For years, nothing changed. Then, one moment broke the pattern. It did not begin with a dramatic discovery. It began with pain, confusion, and a child who could no longer stay silent. This case would later teach investigators something critical. The truth often enters the system through the smallest opening. By the early 1990s, the household structure was strained. Children were older. Control was harder to maintain. On one spring day, a disclosure occurred inside the home. The details were initially unclear. What mattered was that the silence cracked. From a psychological perspective, this is a common turning point. As victims age, fear competes with awareness. Eventually, awareness wins. The first disclosure was not made to police, it was made to appear. This detail is important. Victims of family-based abuse rarely go straight to authorities. They test the truth first with someone safer. That conversation reached adults. Adults contacted law enforcement, and suddenly, a family that had existed for decades in isolation was visible. Police began cautiously. They interviewed family members. They reviewed allegations that were difficult to corroborate. Then something familiar happened. Statements changed. Some witnesses withdrew cooperation. From an educational standpoint, this is not unusual. Fear does not disappear once authorities arrive. In many cases, it intensifies. The initial case faltered, but suspicion remained. During interviews, one question kept resurfacing. Where was Heather? She had been part of the household years earlier. No records showed her leaving officially. No confirmed sightings followed. Missing persons cases often fade due to mobility. People move, people lose contact. But this absence felt different. Investigators noted inconsistencies. Stories shifted, timelines blurred. From a forensic psychology perspective, inconsistency itself is evidence, not proof, but a signal. Even when the early case collapsed, officers did not disengage. Something about the environment felt wrong. This persistence matters. Many long-running cases are solved because someone refused to forget a name. Police began gathering background quietly. They reviewed past complaints. They noted repeated renovations at the property. No single fact justified action. Together, they formed a pattern. In early 1994, investigators obtained a warrant, not for a crime scene, for a missing person inquiry. This distinction mattered. It allowed entry without presuming guilt. From a procedural standpoint, this approach reflects restraint. Assumptions can destroy cases. Process protects outcomes. When officers entered the property, they noted the layout, altered rooms, recently sealed areas, concrete where none was expected. Still, nothing conclusive yet. The search expanded to the garden. This was the moment investigators later described as pivotal. Beneath the surface, evidence emerged, not all at once, piece by piece. At this point, language becomes important. What was found confirmed long-standing fears. It also transformed suspicion into certainty. The search widened. Specialists were called in. The property was secured. What had been a private residence became a forensic site. Officers involved later spoke about the emotional toll. Cases involving family systems carry unique stress. The harm is not isolated. It is sustained. From an educational angle, this moment illustrates cumulative trauma. Investigators absorb not just facts but implications. Children had lived here. Lives had intersected here. News spread quickly. A familiar street filled with uniforms and barriers. Neighbors watched in disbelief. This reaction is common. When long-term abuse is uncovered, communities experience shock and denial. How could this happen here becomes the dominant question. The answer is uncomfortable, because it did not look like danger. As evidence mounted, narratives changed. Denial softened. Partial admissions appeared. From a behavioral standpoint, this is predictable. When reality becomes unavoidable, control strategies change. Minimization replaces denial. Blame shifts outward. Responsibility fragments. Investigators listened carefully. Search efforts extended beyond the house. Historical disappearances were re-examined. Connections previously dismissed gained relevance. This phase of investigation is critical. It requires patience, precision, and emotional regulation. Rushing conclusions risks collapse. Method builds cases that endure. By this point, the investigation had transformed. What began as a single allegation had expanded into something far larger, yet one question remained unanswered. How long had this been happening? And just as important, how had it stayed hidden for so long? The answers would not come from the ground alone. They would come from understanding the people involved. Once the property was secured, the investigation changed pace. This was no longer about a single missing person. It was about understanding a pattern that stretched across years. From an investigative perspective, this is one of the most difficult transitions. The scope expands. So does the responsibility. Specialist teams were brought in, not because of assumptions, but because of complexity. Residential spaces are challenging environments for evidence recovery. They are layered with everyday activity, footsteps, renovations, repairs. From an educational standpoint, this case demonstrates why forensic archaeology exists. When environments have been altered repeatedly, science must slow down. Every area was mapped. Every change to the structure was documented. Nothing was rushed. Investigators understood what was at stake. Errors would not just delay justice, they would damage credibility. This case would be scrutinized nationally. Every method would be questioned. So teams followed protocol with extreme care. Sections were excavated incrementally. Findings were recorded before conclusions were drawn. This methodical approach would later become a reference point in British investigations. As recovery continued, similarities appeared, not in graphic detail, but in circumstance, locations, time frames, victim profiles. From a criminal psychology perspective, pattern consistency suggests ritual, not randomness, not impulse. This realization reframed the case. It was not about isolated acts, it was about sustained behavior. One of the most difficult tasks was sequencing. Which events happened first? Which changes to the house corresponded with which disappearances? Investigators relied on renovation records, utility data, witness recollections. This kind of reconstruction is slow, but it reveals intent. Ordinary repairs now had meaning. Concrete work aligned with specific absences. What once looked practical now looked purposeful. As evidence accumulated, interviews continued. Investigators avoided dramatic confrontation. This choice was strategic. From a behavioral analysis standpoint, confrontational questioning often shuts down disclosure, especially in cases involving control dynamics. Instead, officers listened. They allowed narratives to unfold. They noted contradictions. Over time, certainty replaces resistance. Initial denials gave way to partial explanations. Partial explanations gave way to inconsistencies. This progression matters. Psychologists recognize this as cognitive strain. Maintaining a false narrative becomes harder as facts accumulate. Investigators documented everything: what was said, what was avoided. Silence can be as revealing as speech. One of the central questions was involvement. Who knew what and when? This case would later become a textbook example of shared offending. Not one dominant figure acting alone, but a reinforced system. From an educational perspective, shared offenders create unique challenges. Loyalty replaces conscience. Blame becomes fluid. Responsibility dissolves into partnership. As the investigation expanded, its emotional impact deepened. Officers rotated shifts deliberately. Exposure to cumulative harm affects judgment. Managing investigator well-being was not optional. It was operationally necessary. This aspect of the case is often overlooked, but it matters. Healthy investigators make better decisions. Eventually, the evidence reached a threshold, not a single discovery, but a complete picture. Timelines aligned, statements contradicted themselves. The house itself told a story. This was the moment investigators understood the full scale, not just what had happened, but how long it had been allowed to continue. Despite the volume of findings, one question remained unanswered. Why? Why this household? Why this duration? Why this level of control? Evidence establishes facts. Understanding behavior requires psychology. To move forward, investigators needed more than proof. They needed explanation, and that understanding would define the final phase of the case. By the time the investigation reached its final stage, the facts were clear. What remained was understanding. This case was no longer just about what happened inside a single house. It was about why it happened, and how it continued for so long without interruption. From a psychological perspective, this is where the most important lessons emerge. Fred West and Rose West did not operate independently. They functioned as a closed system. Experts in criminal psychology describe this as mutual reinforcement. Each person validates the other's behavior. Doubt disappears. Cruelty becomes normalized. In such systems, moral boundaries erode quickly. What begins as control becomes entitlement. What becomes entitlement turns into justification. Control in this household was not maintained through constant force. It was maintained through expectation. Rules were inconsistent. Punishment was unpredictable. Affection and harm existed side by side. This creates what psychologists call learned compliance. Victims stop asking whether something is wrong. They ask whether resistance is worth the cost. In families, this effect is amplified. Authority is assumed to be permanent. Escape feels impossible. One of the most disturbing elements of this case is how ordinary it appeared. There were arguments, noise, disorder, but nothing that demanded immediate action. From a systemic standpoint, this reveals a major vulnerability. Institutions are designed to respond to acute danger. They struggle with prolonged hidden harm. This case changed how British authorities evaluated domestic environments. Chaos is not always dysfunction, and quiet is not always safety. As proceedings advanced, responsibility became unavoidable. Before trial could begin, Fred West took his own life in custody. This act removed one voice from the courtroom, but it did not end the case. Rose West stood trial alone. The evidence presented was extensive. The verdict was decisive. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. The court emphasized that release should never be considered. From a legal standpoint, the case concluded. From a human standpoint, it never truly could. The surviving children faced a different sentence, one without an endpoint. They were given new identities, new locations, new chances to rebuild. Psychologists note that recovery from long-term family abuse is not linear. It involves grief for a childhood that never existed, and trust that must be rebuilt from nothing. This is why survivor support became a key discussion after the case. Justice does not end with conviction. It continues through care. The house itself was demolished, every piece removed, nothing preserved. This decision was deliberate, not to erase history but to prevent its exploitation. More importantly, procedures changed. Authorities began reassessing how missing persons were evaluated, how children's disclosures were handled, how patterns across years were connected. This case became a reference point, not for its notoriety, but for its failures. This case teaches us something difficult. Danger does not always look like danger. It can look like routine, like family, like normal life. Warning signs include isolation, fear-based obedience, and inconsistent discipline, especially when children are involved. Understanding these signs saves lives. The story of this house is not just a record of harm. It is a warning about silence, about assumptions, about the cost of looking away. Education is the most effective prevention. When we understand how abuse hides, we are better equipped to stop it. And that, ultimately, is why this case continues to matter.